We first started just by trying to identify some substantive issues we thought would be important in the next 2 years. And so we talked about government use of malware, both for data collection as well as equipment interference, and that this seems to be a practice that's both widespread throughout the world, as well as completely unregulated and not controlled by any legal regime, and that there's a need to try and put legal controls on this. We talked about big data analytics, both in terms of profiling and algorithmic discrimination. We talked about just sort of continue to attack the threshold question of the lawfulness of mass surveillance, not abandoning that effort. Real name policies, export controls, information sharing among states. We had a little bit of discussion about whether the sort of destroying the metadata versus content distinction is a legal distinction, if there's work to be done around that. Data retention mandates and cyber crime laws. So that was our very ambitious list of issues we think are going to be important over the next 2 years.
Sorry, David, you're throwing these out at high speed.
Ah, yes, I'm sorry.
And
Where did you?
Not particularly important.
Yeah.
And I'm struggling to keep up because
Okay.
I think they do sound very important. So,
Everything was very important.
yeah. So if you could just slow it down a bit and just...
Okay. In terms of strategies, we started by talking about transparency as an initial strategy, both in terms of how transparency litigation as a first step that can then lead to further litigation as well as lead to further advocacy work. And we talked about transparency litigation broadly also, not meaning it's not always litigation that's under an FOI or ATI law, but other litigation that can have transparency benefits to it. And we recognize that this is perhaps, which is not always, or usually not an effective strategy when there's a national security, in the national security context. One of the advantages of transparency work is that it's an opportunity to engage other constituencies who do transparency work within their subject matter work, but have expertise in there. We thought about, for example, civil society that works on anti-corruption often has a lot of expertise in around transparency about how governments spend money, and a lot of times they're spending money on purchasing surveillance equipment, and so that's an opportunity for collaboration. We talked about this as both an opportunity to educate the public about freedom of information and access to information as principles. There's opportunities to crowdsource information requests in terms of the requests themselves don't have to be made by civil society groups, but civil society groups can be encouraging members of the public to make these requests to their local governments. We talked about is also that we thought, well, what do we need to buttress a sort of widespread transparency effort? We talked about the need for education to the public regarding information regulators, that many people see that when they're in systems where there are information regulators, that they're seen as more as data protection regulators and not accessed information regulators. We recognize that this is going to require capacity building, both that some civil society doesn't have the capacity to do freedom of information litigation, and so there might be some need to do that. And it also require advocacy regarding improving both data protection and access laws. An opportunity also to gather information regarding cross-border collaborations, as well as user notification laws. We also talked about the UN resolution, particularly the 2013 resolution, as being a point of doing work around by sort of a general call for states to comply with the resolution, to encourage civil society organizations across the world to publish report cards on their state's compliance with the UN resolutions. And we recognize that those resolutions are more influential in some states than in others. We talked about how do you engage civil society that is underrepresented in international processes. How do you engage those underrepresented civil society in international and regional processes? And the idea of sort of recognizing who they are, pushing them to be engaged in these processes, engaging them in coalitions, and perhaps even providing resources. And then we talked a bit about capacity building, the need for capacity building with national human rights organizations, and engaging private sector tech with civil society in areas where there's not that engagement. Our last thing we talked about in terms of litigation was the opportunity with litigation, looking for opportunities with street-level surveillance, where you don't have the national security part hanging over it, and also in many cases you might sort of be buttressed by the protections, evidentiary protections in criminal law that would require disclosure to criminal defendants of the processes by which evidence was gathered against them.
And in terms of the engaging of the general public, I guess that's an area in which the general public would be interested.
Yeah, I mean, we talked so much about transparency and how that was an opportunity to engage the general public because at least in most systems, anybody can make a request for information. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to even have any expertise. I talked about how at EFF, one of the things we do is we do these crowdsourcing days, where we have a day where we both open up our office and people come in and for example, we did request information about the use of IMSI catchers from your local police, and we had a request letter that was written that people only had to sort of punch in their agency, and this could either have been done through a platform where the information that is responded automatically gets made public, or people can just choose to share it on their own. But that's a way of sort of engaging the general public and both giving them something to do as well as educating them about the issues.
Do you want us to hop in on ideas, or do you want to go one by one?
I think you could go next. Are you covered? Great,
I was interested to hop in on that just discussion of how to engage with the public, because we had quite a broad-ranging conversation, but right towards the end we spoke quite a lot about that, and some testing that's been done about what kind of language works in terms of speaking to the public, and it's been done by the Citizens. Who was it who's done that testing? Citizen Lab, yes, yay, thank you. And their testing, which was done in the United States, but with kind of oversampling for different minority communities as well, showed that safety was a much better kind of communication of these the problems with mass surveillance rather than privacy. And so we talked a bit about, I actually had written down what Brenda said during one of the sessions yesterday. The way that the Canadian Civil Liberties Organisation talks about it is a right to be kept safe by governments that respect our laws and rights. And in terms of this discussion about safety, there was a caution about going too far into a safety paradigm. I think it's something that Eric raised yesterday. Then you have the risk that the state's saying, don't worry, we've got you, you're safe, don't worry about it. We really want safety plus rights. And in that respect, you have like unusual partners perhaps, in the sense you might have banks as partners, but two other very important people to bring into the conversation about how to communicate this problem with mass surveillance. One is actually to think about marketing people and think about testing the kinds of ways that you can communicate and what actually works in your jurisdiction. And the other really important thing is to have the people around the table to be as diverse as possible. The difficulty of it being like civil liberties lawyers and tech people, as wonderful and bright as we all are, don't necessarily know best how to communicate across different communities. And because the impact is so broad, the need to have a communication that is also broad. I know some of this work has been done already by in different jurisdictions, and we also talked a lot about how useful it is to share those campaigns, the learnings from that kind of market testing across jurisdictions. Just a few other things that we did also talk about. We got into a discussion about the global north, to be really generalising the global north's experience of mass surveillance in the global south. I don't know how useful that kind of exact division is, but acknowledging that, for some members of our group, the real problem is militarisation of the security forces and agencies, whereas for others in the group we had kind of effective laws and perhaps agencies that were just going a little bit too far in implementation. At the end, one of the comments was that perhaps we have enough discussion between the global north and the global south, and what we actually need now is more of a discussion across the global south. Just put that out there. And we also talked about one of the massive challenges being the proliferation of technology for surveillance and for hacking. I'm not sure that we really developed a sort of response for that one in particular. And I think that also a difficulty, a challenge being the effectiveness of the remedies that are received. So in the Hungarian situation, for example, achieving remedies at the European Court is fantastic but difficult to implement at the state level. So really looking at how you can get effective remedies at the state level. I think we also talked about there still being capacity for litigation on metadata and metadata retention, and the need for some really good sharing of information across jurisdictions and experiences in court cases to sort of work out how best to frame those cases. I know I would be particularly interested in those. I'm sure my group members will let me know if I've forgotten any of your burning issues. But I think, the major point that we thought was, how do we connect this mass surveillance in people's lives to actual harm that's experienced by people? And because of the secrecy around it, everybody's affected, but it's hard to make that narrative of how people are affected. So some of the strategies that we talked about were, rather than saying, this human rights lawyer has been, the subject of surveillance, to really talk about, well, how do you feel that your teenage children's emails, metadata are being kept, like finding vulnerable communities or particular communities that might have more of a sympathetic ear across the state.
So just a lot about messaging and crafting your message for your audience, and that we need to think a lot more about that, because shock, horror, we're under surveillance, it's not going to do it for all of the different people we need to talk to. That's right.
Yeah. I think really getting that message of this is happening and it impacts you, and finding a way to talk about that. I'm sure some people in the room have already done that kind of work, And so again, just sharing the experience of what has had cut through in other jurisdictions would be great.
Well, I think our group spoke to that a little bit. So, Chris, you. Yep.
So, of course, quite a lot of the things that we discussed have already been mentioned. So I will try to leave out those bits and kind of summarise the other things we spoke about. We spoke about the key challenges that we see in the next 2 years, which we, in addition to things that have already been mentioned, felt were encryption and protecting the right to encryption. Actually, generally just keeping the debate alive, particularly in the UK, because obviously our landmark legislation is going through now, and maintaining that public engagement and looking for ways to do that. Another point was the democratic and accountability mechanisms. It's come up a lot in the South African context, and several others as well. And then engagement with regulators and the telcos. And we spoke around that issue, and, for example, reducing the data that is available to be surveilled in the first place, and trying to bring in an ethics debate with the regulators and with the telcos. Then we spoke about strategies for public engagement. In addition to what's been discussed, we spoke about how litigation can drive advocacy and vice versa. And somebody already mentioned about how transparency and litigation about transparency will probably play a big part in that. We also spoke about making surveillance relatable to individuals as a consequence of that. Building security into the privacy and rights debate we spoke about as well, but I also really like the word of safety rather than security. I think that's really interesting to consider. Pat made a really good point about measuring the effectiveness of our strategies as well as we go along. And then we actually kind of questioned the question and we're thinking about to what extent is public engagement going to be critical to this? I mean, we all absolutely accept the enormous value of it, but we're also talking about the importance of, for example, educating judges and the problem of the low tech literacy with judges and politicians. In terms of how we collaborate, we spoke about sharing our success stories and sharing the best and worst practices that are happening. Sharing and collaborating on surveillance reporting. Collaborating on building pressure on the tech companies to do that hardwiring of human rights into technologies that we've been talking about. Lobbying international bodies. Building a central repository of key cases that we can all share as kind of landmark cases to draw on. And then as a matter of perhaps more kind of urgent work that might need to happen for the people particularly at risk, making sure that there are trainers available in all of the countries that we're engaging with to do that InfoSec work and frontline protection work, for example, for the journalists who are really at risk. And just making sure that we've got a connected body of trainers that can do that work locally.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks.
That was very, very interesting. The repository of cases idea just sounds fantastic.
So I'll discuss just 3 major points that came up during our session. The first was on the benefits that come from reframing this is a consumer protection issue. We all have consumer protection regulators, or most of us have consumer protection regulators in our countries, and these are often not used as much as we probably could use them. The second major point was the utility of jumping on scandals when they happen. So if you want to get your populace engaged on privacy, every once in a while there's one of these issues, and when it happens, jump. And whether that's subscriber data in Kenya being leveraged by political parties to force people to register for politicians, or whether it's the phone hacking scandal of the UK, there are these scandals, and we should we should really jump on them, because certainly governments jump on scandals or crises when it's effective for them. And then the third major point is that, I live in the US, and so we're able to pressure tech companies in the US because you all use services provided by our companies, and it's difficult for you all to apply pressure to Google or Facebook. But in every one of your countries are national telecommunications companies who in many ways are the biggest providers of surveillance data to governments. Those telecom companies are locally or nationally regulated in your countries. You can apply pressure to them. They're based there, they advertise on TV there, their SIM cards are sold in local stores. Many of us have not been very effective about applying pressure to telephone companies, but we probably should do a better job there, because there's a lot of dividends that can be reaped if we apply pressure there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me open it up to the floor. One of the issues that came up in our group, which we didn't have time to deal with, was the issue of political parties and what role they can play, for good or ill. And another issue which I think Snowden pointed us to is the role of the tech industry, the techies out there, and some discussion that we had around, that one of the things that we do, perhaps unconsciously, is hire people who have these skill sets but don't necessarily have the politics that we have. And then by the time they leave our organizations, they have our politics. And they go off into the world and spread the word. Perhaps I simplify. Okay. I simplified that very badly, or possibly got it completely wrong. Would questions, comments, other ideas that I have one hand and two hands?
Web-based spreadsheet of all the cases involved with mass surveillance and data. And so we've done a first build. It's not up yet, but we would certainly welcome other people to contribute to that. And certainly I'm also trying to make sure we find a way to get the funding to be able to pay an intern or various people to continue to update it. So if anybody has any idea how we could kind of galvanize some modest funds to keep it rolling, that would be really good. But we're trying to do that resource.
Yeah, and there's another effort, a similar effort being put together, and we should connect them, which was being, I think a few of us around the table were part of this, another meeting, that was being pushed by MLDI, and I think they actually might have some funding for it. To gather, internationally, to gather surveillance cases from around the world, and that actually had groups that were representing various regions. So it'd be good to connect those.
I had Michael as you wanted to say something.
Just one of the points that came up in our group that I think also was here is this idea of capacity, and it seems to come up in different flavors. If we are going to start running safety arguments as a form of PR and public engagement, which I'm very in favor of, I think that point that Eric raised yesterday is really critical. We need to have the technical capacity to that. I know that the LRC does not at the moment, and that's the thing that we need to think about. And maybe which either means alliances with organizations that do have greater technical capacity, or that thing of more consciously bringing those skill sets in, and if in that period they get a slightly better set of politics, that's great. So I wonder if there's a potential good, I hate the word synergy, between those two outcomes that we're looking for.
Well, our group had and I think, Christopher, you put it, was an interesting kind of pushback on that sort of, we need to be trained, because I think that's the sort of instinct that training, that's always a great, first port of call, but that it might in fact lead to people relying on what they think are the solutions when in fact maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, there we go. Does that work? Yeah. It's really easy to shoot yourself in the foot with many digital security tools, and I'm always reluctant to recommend individual things, because A little bit of advice can actually do the wrong thing, and if people are lulled into a false sense of security, they think they're doing, they think these apps are protecting them. The app doesn't protect them. There was a great example yesterday given of people using two-factor authentication based on text messages, and actually that exposing their accounts to greater compromise by the state, because many governments now are actively monitoring and then exploiting their ability to intercept text messages. I love security, I love encryption, and I really try and get companies to deploy it wherever possible, but I'm reluctant to advertise security and encryption tools to the lay public. I've gotten all my friends and family to use WhatsApp and all my colleagues, but I don't tell them because of the security. I say, oh, let's use WhatsApp because it's free, or let's use it because it sounds great. I don't want them to think of it as a secure channel. I want them to think of it as just the easiest way to contact me, because I don't want them to say something over that they probably should only say in person.
And I think the point about your point about the effectiveness of targeting the people who build systems, because if they can build systems so that stuff is hardwired in, that then it becomes invisible to the user. The user doesn't have to think about it, but it's there.
Yeah, I mean, probably some of the most important things that have happened in the last couple of years when it comes to the scale of surveillance that governments have been able to engage in is due to the rollout of encryption technology by companies like Google and by WhatsApp. 1 billion users suddenly having and regularly using end-to-end encryption for voice, for text, has really changed the game. Likewise, many governments are now having a much harder time intercepting emails that they would have been able to grab in the past, because Google and other companies have employed HTTPS on their websites. So if you can get Google or Facebook to do something, that can have a huge impact.
I have a hand in the back, and then I have number 2, and then I have 3.
All right, I'll just interject. So just to build on what Chris is saying, the question is whose responsibility is the safety of user bases? And companies have spent years being pleased that high-risk users are doing advocacy on their platforms because it looks like social change. And I think we shouldn't forget, when we're talking about digital security trainings, that we actually, as advocates and researchers, have asks that we can make of these companies in terms of increasing our security. And it shouldn't be the case that we have to look to individuals making sure that their behaviors are always perfect and their tools are always perfect to achieve a baseline level of security.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to give maybe another perspective, another side of the argument on whether we should be providing privacy training or advocating certain tools. I've done this work mainly with journalists, and I still really believe in it despite all of the caveats and all of the problems with it, because at least working with mainly Western journalists, the problem that I'm finding so often is that A, they don't understand the risks at all. They don't understand the issues. They're going into conflict zones and into dangerous scenarios and offering or thinking that they're offering source protection and not understanding the risks, the digital risks that they're facing. So there's a slight kind of negligence on part of many journalists, I say, and some lawyers, I think, as to understanding the risks that surveillance poses to their work. So what we can do through this training is not say, here's this tool, it's a silver bullet, and now you're protected, and your sources are protected, or your clients are protected. But here are the things you need to think about. Here's how you do a digital risk assessment. Here are some of the tools that are available to you that you might want to think about using and go through different scenarios and the ways that they might be used. But I totally understand what Chris is saying, and it's really, there are loads of problems with advertising certain tools, but I don't think the solution is at all to say this is what makes you safe, this is what gives you security, but to get people to actually think about the risks in the first place and do some of that kind of education work. And it's really, really, we've spoken over the last couple of days about how for some people, how for some sources, it's potentially life-saving, or it's potentially will keep someone out of jail. So I really still believe this is really important work.
We are going to have an opportunity to go into another round of discussion in the next panel. So as I draw this to a close, you don't use all your words. You're going to need more of them later.
It was just to address your point about politics, and efforts to change legislation in this area, which is something that we've not talked about. I don't know who it was at EFF who drafted the blog post after USA Freedom, and I remember reading it, and it basically said something like, we've got some minor wins, which we're really pleased about, and it was a hell of a lot harder to do something positive than simply to try and stop something or try to tear something down. It's much easier if the government put something forward and we're just trying to, crap all over it, just make it a demon, and just paint it with ugly feelings and ugly colors. It's so much harder to get something that we think has some good bits and push that so that we get more good bits out of it. And I think that this is new for all of us. And it's a massive gap in how many of our organizations are structured. We don't have people, the ACLU do, Liberty do, I guess there's a handful of others that do as well, but that are working very, very closely with politicians, have influence there, and have 5-year plans, 10-year plans to push legislation in that direction. And I think we kind of either need to get out of that game or work out how we're going to do a much better job of it. But it seems like the gap in the room and where we're going to have to head next.
Yeah, just in terms of capacity building, I think I actually understood Mike's question as not being as much about the benefit. I mean, there's one of the benefits of having technological capacity within your group is digital security, but I also think it's important to have it in when you're talking about surveillance, be able to have some baseline understanding of what the technology is, and I rely on our in-house technologists like 100 times a day, because this is something I had a lot of background in before I start doing this work, and I'm spoiled in that way. So I understand that there is a great need of capacity building of organizations need to have technological support so that they have a better understanding of what the actual surveillance technologies that are being used are, and that becomes really important both when you're litigating and when you're doing advocacy work.
Thank you. I'd like to wrap this session up and give you a quick break, but I'm going to hand back to Michael, and he's going to tell us what to do next.
Quickly. So just 3 things. Firstly, if you have a per diem form and you've done it, please give it to me or Lucilla as soon as you can. That'd be great. Secondly, tonight, instead of a cocktail party, get down, we're going to go to a restaurant quite close to the hotel. I should have announced this earlier, so my apologies. If you could come and let me know now if you are not attending, that'd be really good. Otherwise, we're going to just count the numbers in this room and assume yes. If you're not attending tonight, please let me know as soon as possible. I should have done this earlier. And then thirdly, we are running at a bit of a delay, so let's take a 20-minute break. So the one panel should have started 5 minutes ago. Let's take 15, 20 minutes, come back, and we're just going to run on it.